A young lady and a boy are watching a news report about missing university students. The lady abruptly turns off the television and instructs the boy to begin studying. The boy's father then harshly hits him and orders him to listen to the teacher. As the father leaves for a business trip, the teacher interrogates the boy about his father, delving into personal matters. The boy surprises the teacher by reciting a series of dates that correspond to his father's supposed business trips. Sensing the teacher's confusion, Jean asks for permission to use the restroom, which she grants. However, he reveals a hidden hammer behind a portrait in the restroom, and he kills the young lady with the hammer. The story begins when Jean wakes up from the nightmare of being dropped by a high place. While he goes to the school, we see a young man and an old guy cussing at each other. Jin's father Dongsu walks up to them to mediate but ends up getting punched. In the school, Jin hears a text telling warning about the disappearance. As he ignores a couple of girls talking about it when Pan jumps in between and tries to play off the text as nothing serious. Bo tries to say something but ends up getting beat. Pan comes across Jin and threatens him. Bo follows him and slaps Jin. After school, when Jin is returning home, he sees the Bo beating up another kid for forgetting his wallet. Jin from far away smirks and takes out the wallet. He turns forward but sees Dad with a cold patch on his cheek. He laughs awkwardly and walks away. Jin feels disgusted seeing that. The next morning he gets beat up by Bo, who figured out that Jin must have stolen his wallet. Though Jin keeps on denying, but Bo doesn't stop beating him. As Jin is losing consciousness, he sees a blurred figure of a girl shouting to stop. Next thing he knew, he was in a hospital room. A teacher informs him that he had almost died and the new transfer student saved her. The stranger student introduces herself and jokes about waiting for repayment with a smile. The teacher goes out due to a call and Kyun wishes to him that she had told the teacher everything. The teacher comes back and informs Jin that his father was coming to pick him up. With a face filled with dread, he shouts to the transfer student to get out, which confuses her. The teacher tries to say something but Jin apologizes and asks to be left alone. Kyun angrily slams the door while leaving. Jin looks out of the window and sees Dongsu getting scolded by a grandson as he didn't trust he was trying to help his grandmother. Jin, who is looking at, flashes back to killing the teacher, but as he is shining the hammer, the teacher turns into his father. Jin grits his teeth in disgust and calls him a hypocrite. The teacher leaves Jin and Dongsu alone. After talking, Dongsu slowly walks towards Jin, takes out the ripped ad for the tutor and asks if he did it. He flashes back to his hammering the teacher, but then he drags her body to a door behind the cupboard and knocks. After opening the door, Dongsu asks him to drag the body in and clean up the mess left behind. He thinks of a time in elementary school speech about kindness and love being a way to happiness. Feeling helpless and disgusted, he falls to his knees just thinking Dongsu was a murderer. The earliest thing he could remember was him in a hospital room. He was disabled, missing one eye, an artificial valve in his heart, and lots of metal pins and plates on his joints. One day he saw his father pulling a woman covered in blood. He asks for his help, but all Jin could do was vomit. When Jin looked up at Dongsu, he saw disappointment. He felt fear that stopped him from vomiting anymore. All he could do at that moment was look at Dongsu with a forced smile. Back in the hospital, he denies ripping the ad for a tutor, which Dongsu seems to believe. He asks if Jin knew any new target, to which Jin give the Bo's name. Dongsu slaps him and asks for a girl's name. Jin tries to hide the transfer student, but Dongsu tells he saw a girl from his school. Jin asks if that girl was the new target, but Dongsu sounds unsure. He checks Jin out of the hospital and gives Jim a description of the girl and asks him to find out. At home, he does some push-ups as he goes through the description Dongsu told him and thinks it must be Kyun. As he is taking a breather after push-ups, his Dongsu comes back and calls for him. Jin tries to calm himself down to hide the fact he was training and walks up to him. Dongsu suspects him of training and asks, but Jin denies it. Dongsu tells Jin they would go to a party in Minjiang Place and to get ready. After the uncle and dad have drinks and have talks, Minjian brings out how Jin has grown and how he must have grown stronger. The uncle suggests an arm wrestling match, but Jin denies it at first. Uncle remains adamant, so Jin agrees. When the match starts, Jin starts wanting to win and exerts all his strength. Dongsu slowly begins to win, and as Jin is exerting his all, Dongsu asks when he had gotten so strong with a smile. That makes Jin shiver and ends up losing. Jin realized he made a mistake and remembered how cautious Dongsu really was. He always kept an eye on Jin, and if he ever felt threatened he would kill him. Pan beats up Bo for nearly killing Jin and causing trouble. Manny sees Jin and calls him. He says that they have beaten up Bo and implies that Jin should forget about yesterday. Jin complies and acts as if he did know what he was talking about, making Manny chuckle. Manny orders Pan, who forces Bo to bow and apologize as he holds Bo's head to the ground. Manny glances at Jin and sees him smiling. After Jin and Bo leave, Manny asks Pan if Jin is afraid of them, and Pan says everyone in the school was. While returning home, Jin thinks although they were a scary group they didn't have what it took to scare him, as he was living with the devil. He meets Kyun out the gate where she calls for him. Later they sit on abandoned grounds as Kyun is eating ice cream that Jin had brought as thanks. She begins to ask why he acted such as in the hospital and why he didn't want his father to come. Jin tries to play it off as him being embarrassed by his dad, but Kyun is angry hearing that and remembering her own father, and tells him to be nice to his dad while he is still there. While taking the train home he remembered the argument with Kyun. Kyun acknowledged that she might be being noisy, but Jin's dad seemed worried for him. Manny meets him and starts talking to him on the train. He says his dad and Jin's dad were competitors in the company. As they talk, Manny invites him to a gym where he trains. After the gym, Manny invites Jin to have some fun, but Jin declines it. Manny does push and say goodbye, but Jin asks him to teach him as he wants to grow stronger. Manny is confused at first but then starts laughing. He threatens Jin. He orders Jin to get down but freezes when he sees the glare. He smiles and tells he has guts. In a hotel, Dongsu gives a speech about happiness, again impressing young women. Later he is in bed while the woman is taking a bath. When he sees the woman out of bath he sees similarities with another girl. She asks if she can come near and Dongsu agrees. The next morning he wakes up and sees the woman lying asleep. Still seeing similarities he moves to go for the actual girl. Kyun house has a threat stuck to the door by a lone shark. She visits an shady place where a suspicious woman asks if she is doing it or not in an annoying mood. Still unsure, Kyun tells her she will contact in a week. Manny starts training Jin. During break Jin sees Manny looking at messages from girls. Jin asks what he does with the girls to make money. Manny smiles and tells him to come with him. In an abandoned hut, three suspicious guys are having a meeting. The guy in the hat asks for money for his stuff, but the other two denies. When the hat guy asks if there was a problem, the guy with the green shirt throws Dongsu's photo saying they knew who he was and blackmail him to keep providing fresh stuff without pay. Next thing we see Dongsu stabbing one of the guys in the neck. He says he gave not for the money but to give new life to them who gave him brief pleasure, and as a goodbye. Kyun decides to go to the suspicious place, which happens to be a karaoke place with female service. The lady asks if someone asks her age. Kyun replied her lips sealed. Three drunk adults come to the place. One of them thinks Kyun might be a minor but the other jumps in not caring and chooses her. Later in the room, drunk guys are singing the whole time being too intimate. The guy who chose Kyun puts his hand on Kyun's lap and starts rubbing it. Kyun is uneasy but not sure if she should fight back. Outside the clerk and a guy is talking. Manny and Jin enters the karaoke. Manny leaves Jin on the clerk's desk and takes the woman to a room saying someone else will come for him. The drunk guy begins to touch Kyun a bit more inappropriately and Kyun slaps him on reflex. Kyun tries to apologize saying she was new to this, but the drunk guy didn't care and slaps her and begins to drag her out, calling for the manager. Outside, Jin sees a drunk guy pull Kyun by the hair. He remembers what Manny taught him and punches him but afterward ends up getting beat. Later Kyun and Jin sit by a river. Jin asks why she was there and in an agitated state blurs out about her parents, debts, and loan sharks. Jin asks how much her debt was, making Kyun a bit surprised. She asked if he wanted to pay it in a joking manner. Jin replied not immediately but soon. Kyun replies sure, not believing him. Manny is surprised to see Jin land a hit. Dingsu messaged saying he has deposited money into Jin's account and asked if he found her. He glances at her and blurs out if she would go to such places again. The reply comes from Manny instead of saying no. Manny tells he took care of yesterday and Kyun was fired. He says everyone has circumstances and it's not wrong to do so. He said he knew Kyun was the one who saved Jin and he didn't want Jin to him disappointed. Jin thanks him and asks what happened with the woman, but Manny just asks if anything happened yesterday, playing dumb, and leaves with a smirk. When Jean glances back at her he sees her joking around with other guys. He almost messages that he found her at first but deletes it and sends he couldn't find her. Instead when Kyun sees him and says hi. Class starts teaching sex edition. While other students are laughing and giggling, Jean is confused about the topic. After school when Jean and Kyun meet at the abandoned ground, Jean asks Kyun about the stuff in class fluttering her. She isn't sure at first if Jean was joking or not. She pinches his cheeks while scolding him but that confuses him more. Kyun tries her best to explain but is too embarrassed and ends up fumbling her words. She asks why he wasn't questioning his friend but Jean replies he didn't have any. Kyun asked about his parents but Jean gets flashes of him listening to the noises behind the door after his father pulls the woman in and vomits. Seeing that Kyun is more confused. Under the bridge, Manny starts to teach Jean about the fight. He asks what's the most important thing in a fight to which Jean replies brutality. Manny says it's close enough and tells its guts. He tells Jean in a fight one should be ready to do whatever it takes to win. He uses Pan for example. He lets Jean go after he replies he understood. Pan asks why he was teaching him and Manny just says it is fun. While walking home Kyun thinks about yesterday with Jean and laughs at how naive Jean was but remembers him vomiting and thinks if he had some trauma. She comes across a shop with a job opening ad. Dongsu enters the shop himself. Kyun roams the shop while Dongsu talks to the clerk. After he finishes talking he goes back to look for the item. Kyun comes back to the front missing Dongsu by a bit. She talks about job openings but the clerk is reluctant to give a schoolgirl night shift but agrees. Manny enters the shop and calls Kyun transfer student. Dongsu hears that and looks at Kyun and Manny from back. After Kyun has talked with Manny she leaves. As he goes forward he sees a mobile and picks it up to see an old guy on screen. Manny tries to buy cigarettes and Dongsu comes back saying it's not good for a young boy. Manny just gets irritated and is who he was. Manny tries to threaten him grabbing his collar but lets go and walk out. Dongsu buys a drink and walks out with the phone. Back in the office he unlocks the phone and goes through the chat. One chat shows her talking with a friend about saving someone and how that guy was a jerk. He also learns she is in debt and hiding her address. Another message is someone threatening for money. While going through the gallery he finds out that it was indeed the target girl's mobile and begins to laugh uncontrollably. After a while, he sends every employee home early. On mobile he messaged the guy that the payment would be today. On the way back as Manny and Jean are talking they meet Kyun. She tells she lost her mobile in tears. Jean calls the number but he recognizes the voice on the other side and freezes. After the call gets hung up he lies that nobody picked up. At first Dongsu messages them to meet at a station. When the loan shark get there though he messages again and said to just come to her house. The loan shark is annoyed but still goes to her house. Nearby Dongsu who was hiding follows them and finds out the target's home. Jean asks where she lost the phone and if there was a security camera there. They visit the store and look through the security video and find out an old guy took it. While Kyun and Manny are talking about the old man Jean is frozen there looking at his dad in the video. Jean grabs the shoulder in a panic state and asks if he had a passcode on her mobile and if she had her photos in it. Kyun said she didn't have any pass but had a photo. Jean screams at her. After calming down and apologizing he gives her cash and tells her to stay out and not call her mobile no matter what. He promised to get her phone and runs out of the store. Manny starts to piece it together and realizes that the old guy was his father. After the loan shark leaves Dongsu goes to the gate and meets the grandfather. He messages Jean that he found the target's home. Reading that all Jean could do was scream to himself. Jean asks if he was waiting in her house with Dongsu replies yes. Jean tries to think of a way out of this. He messages that police were in their house. Dongsu immediately runs back home. At home, he sees Jean on the sofa with the lights off. Dongsu asks about the police and Jean says they were asking various questions. And they came because of a fight on their floor. Dongsu puts Kyun's phone down and asks why Jean didn't tell him that he has found the girl. Jean plays it off saying he didn't get a chance to as this was the first day they met and stuff. He then said after he messaged him about finding out the house he thought it didn't matter. Jean then say now all he had to do is bring her to the apartment. After going back to his room he breathes a sigh of relief but is confused why he is relieved. The next day Jean returns Kyun's phone who hugs it in relief. As they are talking Kyun said she found out it was her dad. Jean asks how she knew and Kyung replies that Manny has told her that his dad was a CEO and remembers the talk about the debt and laughs. While running with Manny, Jean brings out the topic of first crush. Manny asks if he liked Kyun, making Jean stumble and fall. He denies it. Manny starts talking about Kyun and asks if he could have her freezing. Jean tells he doesn't know about these things and Manny says, then Kyun must be your first crush. Back home he remembers that his dad would be late because of new projects and starts eating canned food. While eating he thinks about Kyun and unconsciously blurs out that he wants to save her. As Jean is making excuses to himself he throws the phone on the bed. Hearing a message ding he jumps to grab it and see it was a message from her. He begins chatting with her while fidgeting and grinning and ends up falling asleep. He dreams about the falling but this time sees Kyun, who hugs him. Dong-soo returns with their uncle in a drunk state. The uncle sees Jean sleeping without cover and gets near him. While he is covering him he hears Jean saying a girl's name and laughs. Dong-soo is confused but the uncle just says that Jean is a man now. Dong-soo goes near the bed and lifts up the cover and sees something making him a bit unhappy. He then sits on the sofa thinking it might be over. The next morning Jean wakes up flustered about the dream he had. Wanting to save her, Jean begins writing down all the characters of his dad's victims and trying to find his preferences. He meets Kyun on the usually abandoned ground. He is flustered and is more conscious of her. They start talking like usual. Jean says he was trying to fight someone and Kyun replies she would be by his side and support him. As he walks home he thinks of his life till now. He thinks about Kyun and how her smile made his heart beat fast. He denies he is grown now and doesn't want to live under his psychopath father. One of the loan sharks burst into the room telling the other guy the loan of Kyun had been fully paid, confusing the other guys. Back in the convenience store, the boss leaves the shop to Miss Kim's employee and Kyun. Miss Kim gets ready to teach Kyun when she gets a message from Jean. At the end of the shift Jean and Manny visit her. As Jean is more aware of his feeling for Kyun, act more awkward during the conversation, making Manny cringe. Kyun asks why they were even here. Manny tells he wanted to take a ride with her after work and Jean agreed as well. While talking on the ride, message about missing pops up again. Manny isn't totally convinced but says that it does match the news. While going through the message Jean notices that there were 6 victims but he only knew about 4 of them. A truck suddenly tries to overtake from the side, making Manny hit the back side of the car, denting the back side. Manny is angry at first but lets it go, saying it's fine as long as he fixes it before the family trip. In the end, they reach a western beach. Excite Kyun goes ahead and starts talking to fishermen. Looking at them, Jean and Manny talk about why they like fishing. Hearing the answer, Jean begins to think why his dad does what he does. After they sit down, Kyun immediately denies any alcohol as he was their driver. Watching Manny and Kyun argue about her last workplace, Jean smiles. When Kyun and Manny are alone, she again asks why he was nice to Jean. Manny tries to say there was no reason but Kyun immediately denies it, saying he must be fresh prey to him. Manny said Jean was more than that. He had approached him because his dad was a big company and if they ever meet at the top it would be easier if there was someone who owes him. But now he actually likes him and nobody will say anything to him if he had one lover friend. Behind the curtain, Jean hears everything and gets emotional, remembering how he was alone till now. As Kyun and Manny toast his name, Jean begins to tear up. In the office, Dong-soo remembers his talk with Jean after the police visit. Jean says his going to her house was sloppy and dangerous for both of them. He brings out various points and ends by asking him to respect his opinion. He smiles, finding it interesting. The next day, Kyun talked to a girl about joining the art club. On the rooftop, Jean is reading comments to a post about wet dreams. Bo calls Jean out and asks if it was true that he has been hanging out with Manny. Hearing Jean say yes, Bo grabs his collar and begins spilling how much he had worked to be his slave. Jean replies he was Manny's friend and not a slave. As he walks away, he says he did steal his wallet. Pan warns him to be in check but he just walks by. Finding out that Kyun was in the art club room, he goes there to see her. As he is enchanted by Kyun in the club room, some seniors call Jean and start talking about Manny being cocky as a freshman and Jean was acting up as well. The senior points and asks if he stole Bo's wallet. Seeing that, Jean just smiles, saying Bo had switched sides. The senior tells him to follow him. Manny is in a garage talking to the mechanic about the car when he gets a message. Back in the school, senior asks Jean to call for Manny but Jean says Manny won't come. As the bully starts to beat Jean up, Bo tells them Jean was weak and might actually die. Senior still beats him up not caring about it. Senior grabs him by the collar and a female senior brings out a lighter to burn the hair that was covering his right eye. As she is getting close, Manny calls out telling him to put down the lighter. The senior goes to him while cracking his knuckles. Manny tries to de-accelerate the situation saying he didn't want to start anything with them. Senior, just one of Manny's guys, was being a jerk to one of his guys. Bo spills everything Jean has said to him about being friends. Manny asks Jean if he was a friend but Jean stays silent. Senior tells Manny to beat Jean instead but Manny punches Senior in the throat. As the other one comes at him he calls Jean saying to watch and learn. After some time he beats both the seniors and throws money at them. Manny asks Jean again about being friends but sees Jean silent leaving with a smirk. Pan threatens and scolded Bo for the recent trouble. Frustrated Bo tells how Jean was passing him off and recent Manny behavior should have passed him as well, to which Pan couldn't say anything. Inside, Jean spits gum on his hand and goes to the class. Kyun sees Jean hurt and pulls him to the infirmary. After cleaning the wound and putting on bandages they start walking out. Jean stuck the gum on Kyun's hair and then points it out to her. Kyun is not sure what to do and Jean asks her to go to the hair salon, making Kyun different than his dad's preference. In the salon, while Kyun gets ready to cut her hair, Jean tells her to dye it as well. Kyun rejects, saying his grandfather had dementia and thinks of her as his mom, so she couldn't change her hairstyle too much. But before he could reply he hears someone saying it's sad. Jean recognizes the voice and turns while the voice says it is fine to not cut the hair or dye it because of gum. Behind them Dongsu was sitting with paper in his hand, tells she looks perfect as she was. Dongsu calls Jean for a talk. After they reach the restroom Jean asks how he knew they were there. Dongsu, after the night with their uncle, had checked the hammer and the police to find out that Jean was lying. So he had been following him. Jean angrily asks what he was to him. Dongsu, silent till now, asks if he liked her. Jean denies it but Dongsu starts laughing and asks when he grew a nerve to talk back to him. He tells he knew something like this would happen someday and calls him useless. He tells Jean even if he thinks that he has gotten tough he couldn't report him. Clenching his fist he glares at Dongsu till he was lying and reminding him that he has tried to throw Jean off a roof. The dream of falling off the roof had always been his dad tossing him. Dongsu glares at him and Jean glares back, saying he didn't care about him and wasn't alive because of him. He tells Dongsu he wasn't his property. Jean asks if he was gonna kill him but Dongsu thinks that there would be traces left. Jean brings back his good son's face and requests to let him go then. As he walks away Dongsu tells Jean that first love never lasts long. After Jean goes out Dongsu remembers the fall incident and finds what just happened amusing. Jean starts pulling Kyun, all the while Kyun tells him to slow down and asks if this was because of his dad. Hearing Kyun says his dad looks like a nice guy he shouts at her to shut up. He admits he might look like a spoiled brat to someone like Kyun who had lost her parents. But unlike her, he didn't have any good memories of his dad tearing down. Surprised, Kyun apologies and hugs him. Jean takes Kyun to her home using the message as an excuse. After making sure she was inside he goes to the police station unsure of what to do. He wants to report as it would all be over once he reaches home but remembers everything that had happened in the restroom. When the officers call out to him he says it's nothing and runs away. In an alley, he thinks that if he reports he would be charged with being accomplice and his life would be over. Plus he didn't want to know how Kyun would look at him if she found out. He loses his mind as he crouches and asks for help but remembers he had made a vow to fight him and protect her no matter what happens. He calls his dad and tells him he was running away from home. Jean starts talking about his father and threatens to cut his hands if he touched her. A girl gets attacked by someone hiding in the jungle and gets dragged away. Jean comes past the same route. As the murderer is watching he says he smells blood and walks away. Kyun is on her night shift when the owner comes. He picks up an umbrella while talking with Kyun and walks go back. Kyun begins dozing off when Jean walks in. Kyun asks why Jean was here so late and Jean tells Kyun that he had run away from home, surprising her. On a car trunk, we see a bag wiggling and the trunk is closed. Jean asks if he Cloud stay at her place, earning a slap on the face. Kyun says they couldn't, which confuses him. Jean isn't sure why and asks her but Embraced begins to say stuff that still confuses him. She tells why he wasn't asking Manny but due to a recent incident, he wasn't sure if he should. Seeing him dejected Kyun is really conflicted. Jean finally understands and starts saying but Kyun shuts him up. He said he is fine with the living room couch, but Kyun replied they didn't have a couch. She reluctantly agrees to let him stay for the day. Kyun tries to borrow umbrella from the storeroom but finds it empty. Guessed that the girl's next shift must have taken it. In a dark room, the victim is tied up to a chair. The murderer keeps on hammering her head while telling her to look at her. After the girl dies, we see Miss Kim's face covered in blood with a creepy smile. Under a bridge, a group is beating Bo for switching sides. Others are talking about how Manny stood up for someone and called him a guardian angel. Manny is irritated and mad with all the gossip and threatens one of the guys. The guy in the yellow jacket Jinsu keeps teasing him, not fazed by the glare Manny was giving him. Though he says Manny could easily beat him, he doesn't seem scared. Then with a smile, he suggests an idea to Manny. After Kyun's night shift ends, both Jin and her return home. While entering, they meet police patrolling, which Kyun finds weird, but Jin smiles as he had called an office hunting target in the area. At the door, Kyun looks at Jin taking out what looks like a security camera, as his dad was obsessed with reputation and social standing, making security cameras his fatal weakness. Jin sets up a camera while Kyun looks confused. She asks why he was doing, and Jin excuses, saying that the area was said to be dangerous. Inside, Jin is surprised by the condition of the house. Cold water, cockroach, toilet, etc., reminding him again how good his life was. Kyun herself is embarrassed and mad, looking at how Jin reacts. While on the futon, they talk a bit as Kyun asks why he wasn't with Manny, but Jin realizes he might have relied on him too much. She asks if he left home because his dad hit him or nagged him, but he replies no. Not knowing what to say, she says goodnight and sleeps. Outside, Dongsu comes but sees the camera and police officer patrolling and smiles. He hides from oncoming officers and hears them grumbling about random call making their patrol. The next day, Jin wakes up to see Kyun's grandpa right on his face. After some time, he is drying his hair while Kyun makes breakfast for grandpa. Kyun suggests to skip breakfast and leaving early as they were late. At the school gate, Pan sees Manny bit worried about gossip, and asks if he should crush Jin. Manny tells him to not worry and bring Jin after school. While debating if he should ask Manny to stay over, Pan stops and tell Manny was looking for him. Jin agreed as he wanted to meet himself. He goes to the bridge with Pan. As he was going to ask Manny to stay over, Pan kicks him down, pointing at Bo. Jin asks Manny what was happening, but Manny just pushes him toward Bo and tells him to fight. Still confused, he tries to ask Manny again, but Manny calls for Pan, who drags him in front of Bo. Manny tells he would forgive him for lying about being friends, but only if he wins. As he sees it, he begins to think how people don't change, whether it was willing or not. Manny was a lion and questioned if he was a lamb. Denying that he was lamb, he gets up and looks at Bo with malice-filled look, saying he and Manny were not friends. Bo tries to attack, but Jin pokes his eyes. As Bo is stunned by it, Jin picks up a stone, brunches off the head. Bo pushed down Jin with his arm pressing on his throat. Jin bites the flesh of the arm and finds a stone nearby and smacks him on the head. Getting a chance, he climbs on him and begins head-butting him again and again. After a few hits, he looks at Manny, telling himself he is not a lamb. After everyone leaves, Jin calms down and asks Manny if this was some kind of the last test. Jin says he snapped the moment he was betrayed, and the next thing he knew he had already beaten him. He laughs at first, but when he gets near, warns him to never act like he knew him in school, as it makes him look bad. He punches him when Jin calls his name and complains that he can't even hit him hard because of his heart. Jin brings up him saying they were friends, but Manny denies, saying it was all an act so he could mess around with her. Jin snaps hearing that and glares at Manny. Manny grabs him by the head and slams him on the ground. He keeps glaring at him and remembers what his dad said. Manny tries to walk away with a warning, but Jin stops him. If he couldn't even beat him, he would never be able to bear the demon. He stands up and calls Manny to fight. Manny said he never liked his eyes that didn't show any fear. He tells him to come. When Jin hits him, it didn't affect him. Manny counters with a hit to the chin, making him unstable and fall. Jin barely stands up and starts hitting again, but Manny keeps his guard up at the moment Jin tried to knee him and tosses him back, using that chance to give the finishing blow. After he finishes, he slowly walks away, saying the lesson was over, surprising Jin and telling him to never act friendly with him again. Manny asks why he wanted to learn to fight. Jin replies he never wanted to be strong and that he needed the confidence to beat someone. Manny asks who, but Jin only says LS well while looking at the corner of the bridge where his dad was standing.